All right. We are actually live now. Sorry everyone for that minor technical glitch. Still getting the hang of this new medium. And hey, Dad, how's it going?
Hey, Ted, good to see you here.
It's great to see
Looks,
you.
yeah, familiar surroundings, your former bedroom.
Yeah. So everyone, this is my father. This is Paul Niedermeyer. He is coming to us live from what was once my childhood bedroom, or at
Yeah,
least, older childhood, I guess.
yeah. And this is Ed Niedermeyer, who, for those of you at Curbside Classic who haven't seen him.
Yeah. Okay. So I wanna start here by just sort of talking about. So I think a lot of people have maybe sort of a lot of folks who follow me have sort of only done so since the Autonocast and kind of my more recent work in automated driving and all that kind of stuff. But and of course my dad, if you're not aware, those of you obviously from Curbside Classics who are here, very familiar with Paul and his work. But for those who are not, my dad runs a website called Curbside Classic, which we're going to talk about more in a second. But what I think some people maybe on both sides of this may not entirely know is that sort of both of us kind of got started around the same place. And so I wanted to start by just kind of first of all, let's go to the beginning with you, because I think before we get to getting into car writing and the things that we do now, we have to give people some context for like how into cars you are. And so
Actually,
or have been through your life. Okay,
right.
so let's be clear about that. So I'm talking about like, because I remember hearing from you for a long time that like your earliest memories, or some of your earliest memories, are of cars. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think one of the earliest memories I have as a little child is being put in as a toddler into that little back storage well in a VW that friends had in Austria, in Innsbruck, and kind of laying back there, looking up and seeing the little twin little split windows, hearing the engine in the back and whatever. So, I mean, it's kind of a deep oral and visual memory that I don't know if it's my first one or not, but it's a very, very early one.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of my long love affair with all things VW.
Yeah, and cars in general, right? I mean, as a kid, you were very drawn to cars.
Yeah, cars and anything that moved. I mean,
Mhm.
trains, buses, airplanes, anything that moved. But cars was, yeah, kind of a primary focus.
Yeah, and at the time, and so for those who also don't know, you grew up in Innsbruck, Austria, as you mentioned. You moved to the U.S. when you were 7. I imagine there was like a pretty. I remember when I lived in Innsbruck, even in 99 2000, the contrast between the cars there and the cars in the U.S. was pretty dramatic.
Right.
So was there something about because I mean cars were not super common in post-war Austria, right? So there was
Not
something kind of intrinsically special about them.
exactly. I mean, not most people did not have private cars. I mean, at the very end, the last year or two, there were starting to be more. Austria's economic development after World War II was lagged Germany's quite a bit, and so yeah, it was very common. I mean, we lived in the city, and we just didn't have cars, and so that was actually a deep, informative part of my upbringing, and it's actually is important that what I said earlier. Oh, in terms of my love about cars, I actually have a somewhat ambivalent feeling about cars because I also see the negative side of cars, and I had a deeply steeped appreciation for uh, how walking and hiking and bicycling and being connected with the actual open environment is like in relation to being kind of cocooned in a car, and how that kind of isolates you, and how atomized, I mean, the whole environment of moving out states and moving to living in a spread out town in Midwest and whatever, everyone being more car dependent, the contrast was very powerful. I mean, in one sense, as a kid, it was kind of really exciting, but I also, early on came to appreciate the pros and cons that way. And I have not actually been a full-time lover of everything automotive all my life. In fact, I'll give you a little inside story. I think it was late 80s. I joined an organization that based out of Arcata, California, that was, I forget the name, like the Anti-Car League or something like that. I mean,
Really?
yeah,
I didn't know that. That's
yeah, I
funny.
know, I know. I mean, and there was a point where I actually threw away most of or sold my automobile quarterlies and whatever. I mean, I went through this kind of idealistic phase at that time, and I living in California and everything else and whatever. I mean, you're confronted with the painful reality of the negative consequences of our automotive culture and what it's done to people and the built environment and the environment and everything else. Um, so that's a little tidbit, but yeah, I mean, I always came back to cars. It was always kind of a thing. I will say though that it's always just was just kind of an interest and hobby, and it was not like this all-consuming thing, which also kind of expresses itself in my relationship to Curbside Classic. In the sense that I also have very strong other interests. I love being outdoors. We hiked 10 miles yesterday. I mean, I do building, I do lots of different things. And automobiles and cars have never been this totally consuming thing. It's just something, a part of my life, for better or for worse, meaning that, probably if I was more totally consumed by it, Curbside Classic might be even a more, I don't know, dynamic or bigger or something, because it just, I refuse to allow it to completely take over my life. I need to have other things going on too. And so that sometimes creates some conflicts and some limitations.
Yeah. So I think in kind of the time period that you're referring to, is this sort of around the time we moved from California to Oregon?
It was a few years before that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was that kind of, that idealistic phase, and we got involved with Waldorf schools and this and that, whatever. It was late '80s, early '90s. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, because I mean, for me, that was the really dramatic, like opening the eyes to sort of the downsides of car culture, right? Was going from, and obviously there was a lot going on in this. It was a big life change, but we went for me, going to school. It was 45 minutes each way, oftentimes, to go to Santa Cruz or some of the other
Yeah,
schools
and
that I
that
went
was
to.
insane. That was insane. Yeah.
And so up until, yeah, about age 9 or 10, half an hour, 45 minutes each way was common. If there's a crash on Highway 17 going over the Santa Cruz Mountains to school, it could be 2-3 hours sometimes. And then we moved to Eugene, and then all of a sudden I was walking to school
Yeah.
in like 10-15 minutes, and it
Yeah.
was like such a revelation for me.
Yeah, you and your sister, I hate to say it, spent did a lot of growing up in the backseat of our Jeep Cherokee and other cars in LA, first in LA and then the Bay Area. And then so when I retired from the TV industry and 30 years literally in a month or so, and then a year later we decided to move somewhere differently. It had to be a place where much less car centric, and I determined that we were going to find a house where we could walk to school and other stuff. And so yeah, it was a huge dramatic change, and one that felt much more comfortable, natural to me, having grown up in that kind of situation more in Austria. And so I find a balance here, and it eventually that it was Eugene also, the fact that Eugene, it's really that in a way that really actually kind of led right to the reality of Curbside Classics, because I wish I'd started earlier, because when we came to Eugene, I mean, Oregon was coming out of this major decade-long depression of the 1980s, and man, people were just still driving all kinds of old beaters and stuff. And Eugene is a town that is not as intrinsically, or a lot of people, as car-centric as a lot of American cities in California. It's smaller, and people are pro walking and pro bicycling and whatever. And a lot of people come to live here to not to have that kind of car-centric life. And really, that has opened up. That's really what allowed Curbside Classic to start, ironically, because I started seeing how many really remarkably old cars were still being used. Well, not that every day, like for commuting, obviously, but people had them in their driveways and the curb, and 20, 30-year-old cars still in functional shape. And so that's really kind of ironically, this is kind of a circle here, but that's actually what gave me the impetus for starting Curbside Classic articles, which were, of course, as you know, originally over at The Truth About Cars, when you and I were both writing over there.
Right.
And in fact, I'll
So
give you more credit. You're the one who really instigated it, because I had taken one of my summer sabbaticals that year, and which I was commenting, because in the summer I was very busy, and you called me or said, "Look, I really wish you would come back and write something for Truth About Cars again." And I said, "Yeah, I'm kind of tired of doing what I used to do, which was mainly like news stuff and whatever, and industry stuff.
right, yeah.
And let me think about it." And then one day, Mom and I were on a walk, and I saw this 1972 Cadillac sitting on the curb downtown in the Whitaker district, and it just suddenly, the impetus was that it reminded me of a almost identical car that I had ridden in when I was hitchhiking in 1971, leaving Towson to come to Iowa. And so really that that's how it started. So we've actually got to the genesis of Curbside Classic, and you played a role in that in several different ways.
Yeah, yeah. So and actually, it's funny that you mentioned that too, because this is something I've been noticing as Andrea and I have been biking more around Portland. So we got some Karmic e-bikes. Shout out to Hong. I'm not sure if he's on this stream, but he was kind enough to lend us a couple of e-bikes, and we've been loving that. And it's, if you are into cars, walking and biking is actually the best way to see cool cars that are out there. And I think
Absolutely.
we are lucky on the West Coast, particularly in the sort of Willamette Valley. There's no salt on the roads almost ever. Maybe a little bit every once in a while, super rare. So cars definitely they kind of grow a certain amount of vegetation of different kinds on them, but like they don't fall apart the way they do elsewhere. And so we're really lucky.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I showed a Datsun pickup truck with grass growing out of a crack in the bed a couple of days ago. Yeah. The great majority of my Curbside Classic finds, Eugene, have been from walking and sometimes biking. But Mom and I walk, all the time through downtown. We do urban hikes and whatever, and that's that's how it started, and that's still where I find most of my cars.
Yeah. So okay, I want to get back to Curbside Classic, but first,
Okay.
it does, as you mentioned, it does start at the Truth About Cars,
Mm-hmm.
and you had been, well. So I remember you started reading. I think one of the first blogs you read was the Auto Extremist,
Right.
Pedro
I mean, I came to
Lorenzo.
the yeah. I'm generally not an early adopter of technology. I'm a middling adopter or whatever, a little bit Johnny come lately, but I eventually do. And the internet was kind of slow in coming to the Niedermeyer household, but eventually got a dial-up service, and it was like, oh, okay. And then the Odd Extremist was the first kind of blog type sort of site that I started early on reading. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then at some point, I just remember you started writing for this blog called Truth About Cars, and at the time, right, it was all like longer form, like 800 word sort of things, and you wrote GM death watches because, and again, you were super into GM as a young man, right? And so was that part of the reason you got into that, or how did the
Well, I discovered Truth About Cars somehow. I mean, they had already started. Robert Farag had already started the GM Death Watch. That's really what gave his blog, I mean, that public exposure. I
yeah
do not remember exactly how I stumbled on it. It must have been some kind of Google search or something, whatever. And it was like, oh yeah, the GM Death Watch, brilliant. That's brilliant because I started my own internal GM Death Watch in, I don't know, sometime in the late 70s or early 80s or so, meaning that as a kid, as a little, I came to the United States, whatever, I was definitely more of a GM person than Dodge, Ford, or Chrysler. And I was kind of enamored by that. It was the glory days of GM in the 60s, early 60s, whatever. And it's just something I really resonated with and whatever. And I watched GM, did a lot of bold things like, for a small car, the Tornado front wheel drive in the 60s, and then later the Vega and other cars. And then increasingly they started stepping on their foot one increasingly more and more often. And in my mind, I started seeing that their long decline start. In my mind, seemed pretty obvious, starting around 1980 or so, or something like that.
yeah
Anyway, the point is that I stumbled on the Truth About Cars, and through that, and I started reading it, and it was just back then an early kind of blog like that. Every article had to have 800 words. It was only one article per day, which is kind of cool, and it was kind of simple site and whatever. It was kind of neat format layout. And I think that was in the summer or fall of 2006. And then that winter, it was a very wet winter, and I was lacking mental stimulation. I had been building for a number of years these rental houses, these fixed moved houses that I was fixing up, and I was lacking a certain kind of mental stimulation. And he had, Frog had made it aware that you could submit, and if he liked what you wrote, he would post it. And so I wrote, my first article actually was sort of an analysis for some reason on the current state of the Chrysler's minivans in the industry or something like that. And I sent it in, and he liked it, and he posted it. And then what I really wanted to do, though, was the series called Autobiography, which was serialized every once a week on Saturday morning. Became my second video. It was the first one, starting with my first experience of riding in the back of a VW in Innsbruck and whatever. And it was kind of a long serialized number of chapters based on simply on my relationship to various of cars through my life. And part of the best parts of it were the childhood things, taking a lawnmower apart and and finding these guys across the street who were hot rodders who somehow ended up with a a Lloyd in Iowa City, Iowa. They couldn't keep their Ford hot rods running, but they somehow picked up this old 1959 or 58 Lloyd, and that ended up being being running more continuously for them than their Ford
That's so
hot rods, and
funny.
driving around the neighborhood with it and whatever. So it was chapters of remembrances of things that happened in my life, and Fraggle liked that, and that came as a regular Saturday morning feature at Truth About Cars. And then I also kept writing other stuff. And but then I was very busy, and usually in the summers I would take a break because I couldn't. I was still having to do a lot of work on my developing my moved rental houses. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and that's for those who don't live in Oregon, life is very seasonal here. Winter
Yeah,
is a good
it was
time.
yeah, it was a December. It was one of those horrible, dark, wet, rainy Decembers, and I was like going bargain. And one day I just said, I'm going to try writing something. And it was like it was the perfect thing to do in the middle of the winter.
Yep.
And I'd stimulated some brain cells that I hadn't used in a long time. And I'm going to jump because that experience of like suddenly rediscovering. I mean, I had written when professionally in my work in the TV industry, I had to write, I mean, just letters and things, but I knew I could write, but I never thought of writing in that way at all. And
Hmm.
it was really kind of a mental turn on. It was like suddenly parts of my brain lit up that I hadn't used in ages and lit up in new ways. And this is awesome. And I'm going to say right now that the single most satisfying aspect of blogging and starting, especially Curbside Classic, has been to encourage new contributors and watching them develop their writing skills. Some of them came with good skills, but we've had a number of contributors over the years who started out pretty rough. They wanted to say something. They had something to say. Their skills weren't poor, and I worked with them and helped them with some editing, gave them some feedback. And it's been amazing to see how many of them, how quickly the writing skills come along. It's just part of the brain of just like any muscle that has to be exercised. And it is so gratifying to have seen so many contributors become really solid regular writers. And it still continues to happen. We have a young kid, one of our newest contributor. He's literally only, I think, 3 years out of high school. And the first thing he sent was very rough. I had to do a lot of rewriting on it. He's got passion. He owns a 64 Chrysler New Yorker, I think a 77 or 78 Lincoln Continental, and some other, a Roadmaster from one of those big
Oh wow.
Whale Roadmasters station wagons. And he struggles to keep them all going. And his first three couple stories were really amazing and awesome. And now his writing skills already have come a long way. So this is something that's happened over and over. And I could name a whole bunch of names here. I don't have time for all that, but it has been totally gratifying. And that's been literally the most satisfying thing of doing this. And it's what most kind of keeps me going, even though at times when I sometimes don't feel like I can. And as people know, I have taken sabbaticals, and I actually retired once about 2.5 years ago. And my good buddy here, Jim Klein, took over for 5 months, and I deeply appreciate that, Jim. And eventually I came back and whatever, but it has been a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm
definitely.
sorry,
Well,
but
and
that's the part that keeps it going, is just seeing people. And I say this also because, not because I'm trying to solicit, but I know there's dozens and dozens of other Curbside Classic readers out there who could, if they, they feel an inhibition. They feel like, oh, I can't do that because it's like we're some kind of, like we've studied this in college or gotten degrees in this or whatever writing. It's not. It's just saying what you know and just putting it down and what you've experienced. And it's actually very easy. The threshold is very low. So anyway, I just had to
yeah,
get it in there because it's a really key part of what blogging is all about, and it's empowering yourself and empowering others,
yeah.
and that's job number one.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's so true, and I want to get into this more because when I started at Truth About Cars, you'd been there for a while, writing fairly regularly. I think Frago started a news blog. I think he asked you if you wanted to write sort of news blog pieces, and you didn't have any interest in it. But I was fresh out of school. It was January 2008. I couldn't get a job
Right.
waiting tables, and and you were
I
like,
remember you said you were going to apply for a job as a plumbing supply counter clerk. I said,
oh my god,
oh, that was the last thing I remembered. And then Mom and I were on a hike on the ocean, and it suddenly popped in my head. It just came to me. It's like, oh, Ted should be blogging a truth about cars. And Farago liked me. I said, hey, my son I think would be a good fit, even though he's not really, a classic car guy in the usual sense. But he's a quick learner and he loves to talk and he loves to write, and those are the critical ingredients. So I referred you to him, and the rest is history.
Yeah, well,
I
so
think we
in
should mention here about a little bit your career, because I think some of the people at Curbside Classic may not know what you've been doing ever since then, because you've got quite a long and growing resume, which is a good thing. Lots of diverse experiences. You've done a whole lot of different things here these last years.
yeah. Well, but really quick on so
Okay.
for me coming into Truth About Cars, not having any experience writing or thinking or even like regularly reading the news about, especially about the industry side of it.
Right.
I felt really lucky that Truth About Cars had already cultivated a bit of an industry insider audience, because I realized really quickly that like the people in the comment section knew way more than I did. And that was actually a really good thing, because it took the pressure off me to try and be the expert, right? And I think this is where, and I know like I struggled with this, even it never goes away. Like writing the book, I really struggled with this a lot, is that putting that pressure to be the expert, to have the take that kind of encompasses everything. Like it's really hard, and that pressure that you put on yourself, yes, it's what allows you to do good work, but it also can really prevent you from doing good work, because as you say, you kind of just have to get out there and just start doing it.
Yep.
And I think what was really critical about Truth About Cars, and why it was the perfect place for me to start, is really similar to what you were saying about Curbside Classic, which is that there's a feedback loop, right? It's
Right.
not, and the way I conceived of it pretty early on was, my job here is not to come up with a take, for lack of a better term, that is so good that it ends the conversation, but rather the goal is to start the conversation, right? Like bring the information together that people should use to be able to discuss this topic. And when I got things wrong, which definitely happened a lot, I got a lot of feedback from the comment section was not shy about that, and like it was just a really good way to learn. And I think that's kind of really similar to what you're talking about as happening at Curbside Classic, though the vibe is very different, right? And the feel, but there's still, it's that feedback loop that you get when you have a real community around your blog.
Absolutely. Sure. Absolutely. I mean, really, for me, blogging about cars and car history has really just been a self-education process is what it's been. I knew actually shockingly little back then, but in relative terms. And what I've learned is just mind-boggling, because not just because of my own research in the articles, but most of all because of all the amazing contributions in the comment sections. And it has dramatically opened my eyes and changed a lot of my biases and a lot of my it's so easy when you're first starting out. It's so easy to do the cheap shots and the simplistic kind of thing. Oh, this car is junky and this car is bad, whatever. I mean, all that has, the nuance, the subtleties, and the fact, I mean, like, for instance, the key thing is that, one of my key things has been which has been the GM Deadly Sins. I kind of take off from Farago's, Death Watch. Well, afterwards it was like, here are all the different, the Deadly Sins is this long series that are all the different cars that contributed towards GM's decline. And the biggest challenge with that, especially in the earlier days, not so much anymore, that's kind of mostly behind, but were people who would like, oh man, my car, I've this, whatever the Deadly Sin was, I had a great experience with it, and I love my car and whatever. And I've had to endlessly tell people it's not the actual car. It was the decision and certain choices that GM made in terms of the marketplace and or other factors about the car generally, how the car performed in the marketplace, not how it individually performs for you, because it doesn't mean that a GM Deadly Sin car is a piece of junk or a piece of crap or whatever. And it's like, I mean, they're love children basically, the cars, and we love them for what they are, especially if they're survivors. We may not think that the parents maybe made the right decision in creating that child, but but the end result is cars that we appreciate and love. And it's always been a challenge to get that across to people, because I have had a lot of people in the comment sections who were sometimes pissed off or unhappy or disagreed, and that's okay, and I understand that. But that's an important distinction between an emotional reaction and kind of more historical analysis.
Yeah, well, and I mean, there's it really reflects a dichotomy that goes through every part of cars, right? Which is, on the one hand, cars are it's just a ruthless business. It's
Yep.
a ruthlessly, it's capital intensive, low margin, consolidation. I mean, it's one of the like most impersonal in some ways businesses that exists, even though it is even, but then at the same time, cars have such this emotional aspect to them, or at least they have traditionally. Maybe some of that's
Right.
going away a little bit, but even today, like cars, people really see cars, a lot of people, as really central to their identity. And so you have these kind of two ways, and it was really interesting to me to kind of get my start writing about sort of more the business side of it,
Mhm.
because that was like, I understood the enthusiasm piece of it. I'd read car magazines and had friends or whatever who are into cars and stuff, and I think you're right, though. It's really hard to sort of reconcile both of those pieces, right? The passion and the enthusiasm on the one hand, and just that sort of cold-blooded rationalism that you have to have on the business side.
Yeah, I mean that is that kind of dealing with the car, whether it's old cars or the car industry or newer, whatever it is. It's always. I mean, well, it's a human reality dealing with the dichotomy between objectivity and subjectivity. And I'll say that it's probably not a big shock when I tell people that I'm probably a little less emotionally oriented, a little bit more objectively oriented in my life, especially as I've gotten older than maybe the average, perhaps. So I'm a little pragmatic and a little dry that way. And that has clearly colored my work in writing about cars. I mean, my series about like autobiography or whatever, that clearly probes the more emotional reactions to cars that I had young. But already at one of my chapters early on was like, realizing when the dust started falling from my eyes pretty early on, back even as a kid a little bit, and start seeing the certain qualities about cars weren't just pure emotional aspects. There were other things. And yeah, but that's the challenge for everyone involved in any aspect of cars. And clearly, what we're not is obviously, and that's a key difference between us and many other sites, is we're not just a fanboy of a specific brand or cars or whatever, or certain type of cars, whatever. We're definitely a bit different, and we encompass a lot of readers and in the community, and we've covered a huge wide range of elements. But I think a key underlying fundamental aspect is that we are willing to probe and look at what any given car really, what its relationship to the market and to other aspects of it was, and looking at trying to find some deeper truth. I mean, ironic, starting with truth like cars. I took that title kind of literally, although I came to see that it wasn't always so much the case. But I still feel like it kind of influenced me, and that kind of resonated with me, and I still feel like we're still probing to find some kind of truth. But yet we also honor the subjective aspect, because it's such a deep fundamental thing, and especially with the old car hobby, when people, find this deep attraction to old cars, and and I have emotional connection to my old truck and whatever. So it's an endless battle to find that balance.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the factors that that kind of helps achieve that balance, which you've alluded to sort of, is the fact that you guys, and by the way, I mean, there's a huge mix of content, as you said here.
Yeah.
It's everything from histories to just pictures with a
God.
few but all kinds of different things. But
And
I
not
think
just cars. We do trains, airplanes, tractors, agricultural equipment, heavy equipment. I mean, the whole gamut. I mean, we've even had articles on old appliances and things like that, and architecture, whatever. So, I mean, it's really, it's people who appreciate things that were built and created in the past. Almost anything. I mean, so it's not just limited to cars. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think there's actually two things now that I think about it that kind of really sort of set how set what you do apart from other kinds of like more classic car enthusiasm. I think especially for the stuff that's sort of more traditional and like aimed at sort of older generations. Which is, one is that it's the human element is really, really important, right? Like the idea that, because you started Curbside Classic, it started with pictures of cars on the road, but that wasn't it. It was what those cars elicited in you. And sometimes that was kind of the history of the car, and it was more about that. But again, like with your autobiography and it was what are the memories that these cars evoked? What are the feelings? What are the recollections? And a lot of times it could be this really personal stuff that has nothing to do with the car itself, really. The car is almost more the setting. But at the same time, it really shows like how interwoven, cars are in the fabric of our lives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've changed our logo, but our original logo was said Curbside Classic, and below it said every car has a story. And that was meant not just every car in terms of a certain name, brand, or model, but I mean every specific car. And that's kind of the key aspect, is that you can talk up very objectively and historically about a certain model, year, or brand of car, but every individual car has had its story being created by its owners and its circumstances and whatever. So we honored that. In fact, this is a key thing too at Curbside. Like one of our main staples is our series. We call it COAL as an acronym, but it's Cars of a Lifetime, and that really started really early on. It's kind of a evolution of my autobiography series, and this is where people tell serialize the stories of all the cars in their life. And I mean, this has been incredible. And, I mean, we've had even one of them, a kid who got his first car when he was 5 years old. He wanted an old VW, and he talked his dad into buying. It wasn't running. It was a neighbor sitting in the yard or something like that. And he talked his dad into buying it for him, and he still owns it. I mean, he it's that's just one, but I mean, they've been incredible. We usually have 2 or 3 of these series running all the time. So yeah, and then we've just branched, we've just evolved. We also do sometimes very, very deep dives in analysis and history. I mean, we cover an incredible wide range of gamut that way to the whole spectrum. Yeah.
Yeah, and so then the other thing is actually in the title, which is the curbside piece of it. And I think that, like, especially when you talk about older cars, there's this sort of gravity that tends to pull most of the coverage and most of the sort of fandom towards sort of the best preserved, or the
Right.
the kind of most sort of aesthetically refined,
Right.
whatever, and that goes in different directions too, right?
I
There's
understand.
the hot rods and the tuning and
Right.
but one of the sort of foundational things that strikes me about Curbside Classic is that it's not garage queens, right? These are cars that are
Exactly.
actually being used.
That is the fundamental ethos, and that was sort of the beginning. We've certainly again branched from that, but really, when we say in terms of we say that's a real genuine Curbside Classic, we mean a car that is been found sitting at the curb, and the evidence suggests that it's still being used at least some of the time. And what's fascinating is how that varies, because obviously here depending on the location, because here in Eugene, they're typically often, cars that are 20, 30 years old that have just been kind of not used heavily so that they survive and are still being used. And we've got one of our most active contributors, Tatra 87, who has spent the last 2 years living 2.5 years in Japan, in Tokyo. And he does 2 or 3 posts every week. And there in Tokyo, I mean, a very, very affluent city, in a city, in a country that has a very intense car culture. The cars that he finds there are, for the most part, I mean, amazing variety of cars, European and American cars, but they are mostly in absolutely pristine condition, because that's just the Japanese way. It's very rare to find one. Sometimes you'll find one sitting in a forlorn in a corner in a lot or something like that. So it makes for an interesting contrast, because these cars belong to their owners, and they drive. A lot of them he catches on the street driving and whatever. So it's just a reflection of a different approach in culture, and it's kind of makes a good contrast to what we find in the more funkier sides.
Yeah. And so you even you also cover sort of some of the newer development. I think this is where it gets really interesting to me, is when you guys also, because I think there's such sort of differences in, especially people who are even younger than me, who've grown up always having the internet,
Yeah.
and the car culture that's sort of evolving among people who are younger than me is just fascinating, and it's amazing to me. But it is really, really different than sort of, classic forms of automotive enthusiasm. There's been a lot of changes here. And obviously Curbside Classic is, it's aimed at real things that are really on the road, which, not a lot of autonomous vehicles in Eugene, Oregon, or outside of, but it seems like you all are trying to keep pace, at least to some extent, with that. You're not walling yourselves off from the changes that are happening. Kind of, I don't know if you can talk about that.
Well, I can. I mean, personally, I'll be very frank. Also, my own interest in cars. I actually do follow the car industry news and the developments in autonomous vehicles. Not super in depth, but fairly well. I like to stay informed, and I'm interested in that. We don't, we've tried introducing subjects like that, new stuff, whatever, at Curbside Classic, and sometimes we get good response, but it's, I've come to accept the fact that's probably just not our primary focus or brand orientation. I mean, we've done things like that and it works, whatever. But ultimately, I only have so much time. And we tried for a while to branch the site into kind of a more wider. And we also had a wonderful Jim Klein, got access to press cars, and for almost about a year or more, year and a half, he did these most superb new car reviews. They were so objective and beautiful photography, whatever, and they were so wonderful. But there's a lot of new car reviews all over the net, and it's just, it takes a lot of time, and it is like, he just couldn't devote the time. And given the fact that these were labors of love or whatever, I think he enjoyed doing them for the time that he did. But there, when it comes down to it, we seem to kind of tend to fall back towards our primary brand and coverage, which tends to be, but we have no problem introducing those things. It's just that you can only do so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But my own personal interest is definitely, the news is very important to me personally.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if people waited, 50 plus years for a mid-engine Corvette to make it from concept to reality.
Funny you mentioned that. I literally last night I was writing. We do a lot of vintage reviews. A commenter sent me many decades of road and tracks, and I regularly, scan them and put them up. And I put one up. There was one for a '73 Corvette that isn't up yet that I was doing last night, and it said, well, '73 Corvette, we had been promised a mid-engine by now, but I have to tell you, readers, it's going to be at least 3 more years. 1973. That's 50 years ago. Whatever. Anyway.
Yeah, no,
okay.
but there is a little, I mean, it is funny that people are so impatient about something as, transformative as autonomous vehicles when, things being teased and then either not happening or happening much later. I mean, how long has VW been showing a sort of a little electric version of its, or a modern version of its van? It's only just now coming out.
Yeah. Well, this is the problem with concepts. Yeah, it's teasing and whatever. Yeah, it's. What can you do?
You think concept cars have run their? I mean, I've kind of come around to the idea that like people should just kind of stop doing it unless you're really like, switching to an entirely new design language or something, and you want to do a pure styling exercise just to kind of get response to that.
Yeah, you're right. I'm personally burned on concepts, frankly. Yeah, I just rather have the car unveiled as kind of and whatever. But I don't. Yeah, they feel like I'm being taken for a ride a lot of the times.
Yeah, well, and I think that that one of the things that Tesla has done that I think is really positive is sort of, well, and obviously what the line between what's a concept and what's a prototype and what's something that's definitely going to be made on the timeline, like there's a whole lot of vagueness in there. We don't have to get into it, but I think there is something to, really trying to make the effort to, when you do show a vehicle that like, that's what you want to be faithful to in terms of making it as a product. And again, like, lots of ins and outs there, but because in some ways, right, concept cars are a holdover from a very, very long lost time when the car industry was sort of like Silicon Valley is today, right? Where showing people the future and what it was going to be like that was what the car industry did. There was obviously Silicon Valley didn't really exist then.
No, you're right. That was the high, that was a key part of what was considered sort of high tech. There were a few other areas too, in certain things, and even appliances had their own road shows and were part of GM's Futurama and the kitchen of tomorrow and stuff like that, and we can only chuckle about some of those old videos now. But back then that was how people got excited about what was coming down the road in the future.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, Apple has, these events, and I'm just always amazed when you go on Twitter during an Apple event and like everybody is there and everybody is watching, and that it's different in that it's not about visions of the future. I think that's sort of one of the things that's really changed along with all of the technological change that we've seen over the past 50 whatever years, is that it's no longer enough to just, and this is why I think like concept cars should really just go, is that it's no longer enough to just provide the vision of the future. Anyone could do that, especially with CGI nowadays. I
Yeah.
mean, anyone
My God.
can render a vision of the
Yeah.
future. What matters is, what can you actually make that feels
I,
futuristic, right?
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, with CGI, I mean, some of the things the last few years, I can't remember all the names, but some of the different ideas, so-called concepts for completely new car companies or whatever that have been dropped over the year is it's absurd. I think that's partly what's made the whole thing kind of meaningless, because almost anybody can render something and say, I'm going to build this or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and when you have things like, the mid-engine Corvette taking 50 years, and the VW, new wagon or whatever, van, bus, I guess, taking, however many concepts to actually come to reality. I think people kind of strangely need to at least feel like it's plausible. You know what I mean? Like there needs to
Right.
be some
Right.
kind of sense that like, oh, this really could happen, that this is
Right.
not just science fiction, right?
Right. I agree. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you think I think one of the big questions that over the last like 10 years or so, that's really gone through a lot of the work that I've done, is this question of whether the tech sector just sort of increasingly moves into and kind of eats into the car industry, or whether the car industry can kind of recapture the mojo. And again, I think people, especially younger people, really don't appreciate the extent to which the auto industry was Silicon Valley of the first half of the 20th century. What is your feeling about that? And like, has it changed? Does it change, or you kind of have fixed feelings about that?
Well, I have mixed feelings. I it's kind of weird. I'm kind of strange. I mean, I gravitate to. I love intrinsically. I love seeing change and disruption, and I'm always kind of frustrated with the current reality, just my natural makeup. It involves a lot of different parts of life. But then I'm also not an early adopter generally, and I'm kind of slow. And I also like the old too. I had this weird kind of dichotomy that I wrestle with, and so I have. It's hard to put that. Clearly the changes are dramatic and exciting, and there's no question that software is turning out to become increasingly the critical component in the future, in the integration of software aspects of the car. And Tesla has clearly did some serious pioneering in that, and showing kind of the way how that was going to happen, and everyone's kind of scrambling to accept that reality and moving forward. And I think for a while it was kind of is that really the truth or not, or whatever? Is the car really kind of an iPhone on wheels? Well, I mean, it is and it isn't, but clearly it is to some degree or another. And it's happening. We can't deny it. It's a reality. I'm not an early adopter. I mean, part of it, I mean, yeah, I was intrigued. And there was one day I thought, oh yeah, I really got to, I almost took an impulse buy buying a Tesla Model 3 or whatever. But my own life, I just don't drive that much. And it doesn't, so it's not, and I'm kind of a cheapskate, and I like keeping cars and things for a long time. And my utilization of cars doesn't support buying a new car. So it's going to probably be a while before we usually, our habit here in the Niedermeyer household is one new car every 15 years. And I think that maybe even be lengthening. But I mean, I've had my Xbox for 15 years already. And I don't know. I'm not sure I'm ready to give it up even for the foreseeable future. So.
Well, you only just modified it.
That's right. Yeah.
For
Last summer made it
off-road duty.
off-road suitable. So yeah, exactly. I need to amortize that investment. I spent maybe 150 or $200 on it or something like that.
I explain for people who aren't familiar with with the Xbox and what you've done with it.
Well, they probably. Well, I mean, I've documented the expo at its site pretty thoroughly. But basically, you're the one. Who started 5 years ago with some friends. These wonderful off. It's not off-roading in the classical off-roading sense. It's overlanding on lots of rough little back roads, and some of it gets borderline off-roading. You set up. You and some friends went on these expeditions for 4 years in various places: Idaho, Eastern Oregon, and other places. And I was kind of jealous, and I didn't have the right vehicle, whatever. And last year, you invited me along, and I said, "Okay, but I'll modify the Xbox and take that." So I jacked up the suspension a bit and put on some better tires and modified the suspension and put a lift kit on it, and off we went. And I only got stuck once. I only had to be pulled out of one water hole. So I mean, that's all been kind of documented, and it's fun. And ideally, I'd put a limited slip differential in it, but that's kind of a big undertaking, and it still has some real limitations. I mean, in certain situations, it's not going to be able to handle. Because of front wheel drive. If you go up a steep, rocky, rough hill, you're just going to lose traction on it. There's certain situations where four wheel drive is necessary, but it was an
Unless you,
awesome trip and I had a great time and I'm looking forward to doing it again.
yeah, it, usually it was my buddy and I both have Tacomas. Were the first ones to start it, and we've had a number of vehicles join us over the years. But last year, driving through the Nevada desert and watching this little white Scion XB, first generation Scion XB, and it was hilarious because you had to keep the momentum up on this thing because it's front wheel drive.
Yeah.
You're basically using snow tires, right?
Yeah, I had, because I couldn't find there no AT tires for that size available in the United States because no one makes the ones next size up that would have smaller size when available would have rubbed and would have been a problem. So I just got I got some snow tires discounted leftovers, and they're fine. And yeah, it was actually, I may have had the most fun because I love challenges, and for me it was more challenging. I had to be careful about the crown in the middle because of the low, relatively lower clearance, and my front was unprotected. As it is, I bent my radiator support, but I'm actually, in retrospect, it's really lucky and amazing I didn't wipe out the radiator. And the support underneath it is bent backwards, and it's very exposed down there. If I do it again, I have to weld on some bars or something like that to protect it. But yeah, using momentum is a wonderful challenge. You drive along and suddenly you see a real soft sandy spot and you got to really make that roll. So anyway, yeah,
it was like watching a little puppy dog though, or something, we have these big lumbering trucks and this little XB is just like zipping along.
Yeah, exactly. Great time.
Anyway,
it was good time. One of the best times I've had in a long time. It was wonderful. Thank you. It was great.
Oh yeah. Oh, of course. No, we'll definitely do it again this year. In the off chance that Josh Hartung is listening to this, call me, man. We got to set a time. So I wanted to get back really quickly because the Curbside Classic thing, there aren't a lot of small independent car blogs left. I actually just did an episode of the Autonocast last week with Jason Torchinsky. He's gone out. He's found a backer to start the Utopian, which is the utopian.com. Definitely check that out. They launch tomorrow, I think, or no, day after tomorrow. April 32nd or March 32nd. Yeah. Because they had to get done by the end of March. So, so it is starting to happen again, but I think it's easy. The media business, it's been a tough business. I love the work of working in media. It's like constant self-education, like you were saying. And it's just been it's taken me to a lot of amazing places. I met amazing people, and there's just a lot to love about the work, but the business is brutal. And really, really, in my experience, especially trying to start new things, and I think like things like Curbside Classic, where it doesn't fit neatly into a traditional like vertical or genre or something like that, where you're really trying to do something a little more unique. But you've made it work. And so I was just want to, again, in the spirit of what you said earlier about like really trying to encourage people to get out there and make content and everything. I mean, starting your own website is potentially more viable than people think, even if it's not that huge, right?
Yeah, I mean, okay, let's be very clear. I'm also a very impulsive person, and I didn't put a lot of thought to it. In fact, I'm going to give a shout out here to one of the people here that's put some comments here on this live stream, Jonathan Angel. When I left Truth About Cars last time, was not really intending. I don't know what I was going to do. I was just going to get back to my usual work or whatever, and then it kind of weighed on me, whatever. And in the comments in my farewell at Truth About Cars, Johnny Angel there said something about yeah, you're building and writing, but it's easy to find builders, but it's harder to find people who can write well about cars or whatever. And I'd been thinking about it, and it kind of pushed me over the edge. And I just did a Google search on the whether the domain was available, and it was. And then I hired this local woman here, oh God, for better or for worse, and we just did a simple, basic WordPress website, and I had no real ambition. I spent a couple $100, and I didn't think it through. There was no business plan or anything like. I wasn't thinking about it as a real viable business or anything like that initially. I just thought, well, I'll just do it, and I did, and the site did grow. I mean, obviously, it would have been harder if it hadn't been for the following that had been generated from the truth about cars. And for a while there was a lot of kind of back and forth, and a lot of people I think went to both sites and they heard about it and whatever. And so that gave us a start, and it grew quite rapidly, surprisingly. To 20, it started in 2011, and 12, 13, 14, the first 3 years grew quite rapidly. And in fact, really, we haven't really grown since then. It's been kind of a plateau since then, which is okay. It's fine. It found its niche. I mean, I accepted the fact by the nature of what we do that it is going to be a niche site essentially, and that's self-limiting. I mean, we just a lot of things we don't do, and we don't try to do clickbait. We don't do video, this, that, whatever. So it is kind of it finds it's found its own level. It took a lot of work. It was challenging and frustrating. The first couple, 2, 3 years, I was blogging like a maniac, and it was difficult. I should have been doing other stuff too in my work in my life outside of that, and a lot of sacrifices made. And then we put Google AdSense ads on, and they generated very, very, very low revenue. It was frustrating, and I had kind of a love-hate relationship. I mean, most time love, but I would get very frustrated at times. I mean, it's kind of a monster having a website. It's, as you know, it's 24/7. It's like having quintuplets. Have to be fed all the time, like having and so there have been times when I've been challenged by that, and I like I said, I retired for 5 months back 2.5 years ago, and when I came back, I did a smart thing. I did some research, and I found that there are other ad networks, and I changed networks to AdThrive. But you have to be big enough in order to take you. You have to have at least 500,000 page views per month, which were well above that. And so I was able to join AdThrive, and that made a substantial boost in the ad revenue, which at least it's not big money here, but it made it a little bit more viable for me to feel like I can spend the time that it takes to keep the site going and operating and running, and yeah, so it's but ultimately it would never have happened without the constant influx of contributors. They've come and gone. Some have stayed forever. We've got some guys on that have been doing this for almost from the beginning. Others naturally come and go, and that's completely natural. People say, "Oh, where did so and so go? Where did so and so go?" Yeah. Well, it's human nature. In fact, I'm going to say right now, a lot of my contributors ask for one of our most amazing contributors, Don Andreina from Australia, who did some incredible quality stuff that should be in some of the most expensive, finest history books on a design analysis. And people ask, "Oh, what happened to Don Andreina? What happened to Don Andreina?" Well, he had lost his job at ad writing and copywriter in Australia, and he was living in his parents' house, and he was trying to get his career going, but he loved Curbside. He got so into these deep dives. It was an addiction, and he finally had to break that addiction because he needed to get his career back on track. And he said, "I'm sorry, Paul, I have to focus on my career." And he's trying to reinvent himself as a creative in a kind of a new field. He went back to school and whatever. So yeah, that's where he is. He's fine. He's well, but he just cannot. It's very seductive because, but unfortunately, it doesn't pay. You can't make a career out of it easily. And I had my own I had my own already established my own steady income stream from my rental houses, so I had that freedom to do that. I mean, good luck. I mean, I wish the best to Jason Tochinsky and those. I mean, to do it and make a living out of it is a real challenge. You have to have a backer. You have to have a financial business plan. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's going to be a labor of love. And if you're lucky, you might generate some revenue to help compensate you for the time and effort, but who knows? I mean, there's a lot of sites that are just purely labor of loves, and we're kind of sort of somewhere in between.
Yeah, no, and I think it's been interesting to see, kind of what now in retrospect was sort of the golden age of blogging, right? And everyone had blogs, and it was just this ecosystem, and we had the Truth About Cars, where we got started, would attack the bigger blogs in order to steal their readers, and there'd be these blog wars, and social media existed then, but it was not sort of the pervasive thing that it is today. And in some ways, one of the things I love about Curbside Classic and what I'm really excited about for the Utopian is that it feels these are like throwbacks to that era, right? That it's that it, and I hope that there's still a place for that, because you can't do everything on social media. I mean,
Yeah.
I and this is something that I've been struggling with a little bit in terms of Twitter. Like I love Twitter, obviously. I spend
It's hard to monetize though.
it's hard to monetize, but almost more than that,
Yeah.
it's so ephemeral.
Yeah, I
It's like
understand.
I just compared it the other day to like it's like building sandcastles. You can
I
build the
understand.
most beautiful, amazing sandcastle, but you come back to the beach in the morning and the tides come in and it's just
Yeah.
the beach again.
Well, okay. This is actually a critical thing about Curbside Classics, because when I was at Truth About Cars, when I started doing Curbside Classics, I realized pretty quickly on, oh, these things have long tails. I mean, these things can be, they're not timeless. They're not the latest news and whatever. And in fact, I started a portal at Truth About Cars of when I started, because I did about 200 of them over there. And that portal on the stats was doing well, and people were regularly going to that. And it's like, okay, that's what really made me realize there's some potential there, because this stuff has long tails. And this is why I kind of moved away from doing news and whatever, because you're right, it's so ephemeral. And that is the essence of Curbside Classics. And now we have tens of thousands of posts, and we have archives, and it's hard to keep all track of it, whatever. But on any given day at Curbside Classic, about half of our viewers stats come from Google searches for uniques from some kind of a car or whatever. And they're just one-time visitors on any given day. And so that's a critical part that sustained us. And that's really very essential. I will say too about the evolving scene. I mean, yes, social media has grown, and it's been a challenge, a problem, meaning we clearly have lost some readership, daily regular readership to various different social. There are say Facebook sites for every car and brand and make and whatever. And in fact, what now helps keep sustain us is that if we can do a post that gets passed around on social media, and that has been the case. For instance, in January this year, we had our best month ever, despite the fact that we've been kind of slightly sagging a bit, because I did a series of posts on old diesel history trucks from the 30s and 40s and 50s that were passed around on a lot of social media and got generated a lot of views. And so it has changed, and I think that's why straight blogging is more difficult now, because the media is that much more fragmented, and so. But we have that kind of core, the archives, the Google searches, hopefully getting passed on social media when people, and we're going to have these referrers and whatever. I don't know exactly where they'll come from. Google Android app refer and whatever people, or Google does its own algorithms that put some of our stories out there or whatever. That's important, but it makes it even more fragmented and more challenging.
Yeah, no, but I think your point about evergreen content is a really, really good one. And I think even because I think one of the hardest things as a writer is to think about, like, well, what can I do so that essentially, like, what opportunities for passive income really are there as a writer? I mean, you can write a book, but the money ain't good there, let me tell you. And I think people don't always appreciate it. And I don't want to make a prediction about it, but I get the sense that as social media becomes more and more the dominant thing, and everything does start to feel more ephemeral, I think there is a real hunger for things that are lasting. You know what I mean? And as a writer, if you can build, because again, this is a lot of what, as you just said, a lot of what Curbside Classic is it's a library. It's a library of things that you've written. And I think, like, if you want to be a writer, a really good way to stand out and to potentially create this opportunity to create a library of long tail content is to make sure that everything that you write is something that can kind of last, right? And that was one of the hardest things about writing a book, was that I'd always written in this very ephemeral internet culture kind of mode, and I put a lot of pressure on myself that, like, especially because no one had any idea, least of all me, like, what the hell was going to happen with Tesla. And so it really, wanted to write something that, like, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, almost no matter what happens, that there's still some value to be had from reading the book. But I think that's an opportunity that people don't always think about in this day and age, that if I write and build a library of evergreen content, that's something that can be a foundation
Yeah, I agree, and that's not easy to do on the web, but that's what. And there's some other people out there doing similar things. A couple of them, by Max Motor Garage, a few others. But that's what we're about. And I decided a couple of years back that, I mean, for a while there, I'd get frustrated. I said, oh, maybe I need to sell the site and move on or whatever. I've had this endless kind of battle. I'm never going to sell the site unless it's to somebody or some or you who I know is going to preserve the archives and whatever, and not turn it into some kind of stupid, like some other sites have been like this, like Allpar is basically been disfigured by having been sold by its owner, who regrets it, having sold to Vertical Scope, of course. And it's never going to happen. I mean, I feel a great sense of stewardship and a great sense of appreciation to all the contributors who have contributed so incredibly generously and often not fully. It's been hard for me to be properly appreciative and thankful to them, but this is, I feel a great sense of stewardship, and one way or another we're going to preserve that library and for the long haul. And I think someday in the future people will get a kick out of um, digging through it from one to some degree or another. I'm sure at some point where the audience levels will start to peak down or whatever. It's fine, but it's still going to be there, and we'll keep the server, pay for the server, whatever it takes to keep that going.
Yeah, and so on top of the library too, that's also the community, right? It's the people
Exactly.
who gather together, and one of the cool. I think one of the things that makes online communities the strongest is where you have the barrier between the content creators and the content consumers. To use the sort of business terms, the bloodless corporate
Right.
speak, where that barrier is more permeable, right? And
Right.
that's something that's been really huge at Curbside Classic as well, right? With
Right.
and like talk about like the cohorts and things like that, right?
Yeah, we have a different levels. Well, yeah, we have a Flickr cohort page where people just put up pictures, and then because they don't want to be contribute directly, and I draw to from that almost daily. I try to, I mean, again, I appreciate all the cohort posters, and I'm unfortunately we can never begin to put them all up, but it's like a wonderful. If I don't haven't gone up and shoot, there's always a resource there, and then we have certain commenters who are leave incredibly pithy and interesting and fun and comments, who I've encouraged to be contributors, but no, they just want to be commenters, and that's great. I mean, Justy Baum and others out there who make the reading amusing and interesting. As far as building community, it hasn't always been, a perfect bed of roses. I mean, there have been challenges. I mean, some years back, it was more about, 4, 5, 6 years ago, where there was a bit of a kind of a schism where a couple of contributors moved off and moved away and felt somehow, I don't know, unhappy and whatever. But it's human nature. Some people just have kind of certain orientations or inclinations, and they somehow didn't feel like they could fit in, whatever. And that's okay. It's just how it is. I feel sad. Some people, left unhappy, and I'm sure I have pissed off some people myself, and I regret that. And some things were just kind of inevitable. So yeah, building community is not easy. I'm not necessarily the most perfect personality. I wish I were more emotional, sensitive, and more supportive. Whatever. It's challenging. There's so many different ways to your energy can go. But I am deeply appreciative, and I'd like to take this opportunity again to just thank all the readers and all the contributors, especially. And my apologies for those who I pissed off over the years.
Yeah, things don't always work out,
Yeah.
and I certainly remember from my time at Truth About Cars that you get the most sort of talented and dynamic people together and contributing, and all of a sudden there are all these like interrelationship challenges. People who are really passionate
Yeah.
oftentimes are quite
Yeah.
difficult people, and I think that
Yeah.
goes for you sometimes and me sometimes and almost anybody who's passionate about just about anything. But I think that's also why like having a sense of community is so important, right? Is that
I
it
agree.
helps
Yeah.
provide us with that kind of bigger picture context for what
Yeah.
we're doing, and that at the end of the day, like none of what we do really matters unless other people appreciate it, connect with it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, key. And of course, obviously, we've had to try to make it real clear to leave politics out of it, because that's the critical factor here, which is such a different problem all over the internet and our society being so polarized. And we have a lot of, I'm sure our readers range from the full spectrum in terms of their ideologies and politics, whatever. And we just make a really huge effort to keep that out absolutely as much as possible, so that we find a common ground in our interest and enthusiasm about cars and history and all the different things that we like to talk about. And for the most part, that's worked really well. Like I said, occasionally there have been times when it doesn't, but that's life.
Yeah, no, it's actually something I've had to do. Well, not had to, but I chose to do with my Twitter account.
Right.
Is I just really, and I think I've become a little bit less rigid about that lately. But I think it is unfortunately, and again, for people who may not know, I mean, I studied political science in school. This was like
Right.
like politics. Kind of. Anyway, I'm very glad that I ended up writing about cars instead of politics. Thank you, Dad, for for the little assist in that direction. I do not think I would be a happier person today if I wrote about cars.
Right.
I'm sorry, if I wrote about politics and
Yeah,
not
right.
cars
I
and
understand.
mobility.
Right.
But yeah, and I think knowing what's worth debating
Right.
and what's not is
Right.
a pretty critical community
Right.
skill. So,
And I've had to improve that and learn. Like I said, I tended to be a little intense more quickly over time. I've gotten you just have to. It's not important. It's not important. Just let it go.
yep.
Push it off. Whatever. So yeah.
Some things matter more than others.
Exactly.
And having a place where a lot of people are able to come together and enjoy something and
Right.
share that with each other. That's important. It's like a family, and there are times
we've had a number of physical meetups over the years in various parts of the country. We have in the last few years for a number of reasons. Obviously,
Sure.
most recently because of COVID. But I'm looking forward to doing one. Jim Klein has suggested the Rambler Ranch up in the mountains up near in Colorado, up near not too far from where he lives, and I think that'd be a great site. So I don't know how soon we can do that again, but that's been something we've done. That's been awesome. We had some great experiences there in the past.
Yeah, no, it's funny how there's people. So like Robert Farago, who we mentioned before, was the guy who started Truth About Cars and was really kind of a mentor to me. I've still never met him in person. Like there are so many people throughout my career who have been super supportive and just been really important to me and to my career, who I still never met him in person. And I think like, especially after the last 2 years, getting out and seeing more people and connecting with more people in person, it's really, I think, important to me as well.
Yeah, I agree. I'm gonna try to make that happen. Actually, maybe even later this summer or something like that, or in the fall or something like that. It's kind of been long overdue, and yeah.
Awesome. Well, we're over an hour, so we should probably wrap this up. Anything else you want to sort of cover before we don't have any particular questions? If you have folks in the chat have any burning questions for us before we go, definitely get those questions in now.
Right.
In the meantime, anything else you want to?
No, thanks for the opportunity, and I was wanting to talk a little bit more about your career and your background and all the things you've done, and I'm really proud of you. It's been an amazing journey that you started there with that nudge into blogging for Truth About Cars. I love watching the turns and twists in your career. I'm much more of a slow and steady kind of guy. It's kind of like tortoise in the hare. Well, it's not a race. It's just different approaches. And I know you're now in a new chapter yourself right now. You were with Pave for 2 years, and now you're embarking on some new things. And I don't know if there's anything you want to share or not about, but I know you're going to be thinking about branching out into some new different opportunities and whatever. So I wish you all the best on that. And
Thanks. No, I mean, yeah, I definitely, my career has definitely had some twists and turns. And I've definitely jumped around a few things. And, I've just obviously from covering the auto industry in the kind of more traditional sense to, much more focus on driving automation, autonomous vehicles, and things like that. And then that was like a fairly natural shift. I think like writing a book about Tesla was a really, they kind of straddle that transition in a lot lot of and was a really.
He's talking about his book, Ludicrous, the unvarnished history of Tesla.
Unvarnished.
So, yeah, there it is.
Books back here, but
I probably have one. All right.
So I worked at a couple outlets for a while, kind of trying to start an autonomous vehicle sort of focused, future mobility focused sort of place, but that was really hard. It's a tough topic because it's not an established consumer goods market yet. It's in this weird kind of pre-product kind of phase, and so people are interested in it for a bunch of different reasons, and people relate to it very differently. And there's just so it was a real and of course, because the media business is so challenging, it was hard to get people to really invest in sort of what it would take to build that. And so I kind of moved from media business into PAVE, which is Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. Which is a nonprofit where I was for a little under 2 years. Just left there fairly recently, and yeah, I'm still figuring out the details of everything that comes next. I think one of the things that I definitely am going to do, no matter what, is what we're doing here right now, which is just going live with people who have interesting things to talk about and just discussing them. I've gained I've gained a huge appreciation for it from doing the Autonocast. We've been able to talk to so many interesting people, and it's just so hard to get all three of us together more than once a week. And so this is sort of like a little bit of Autonocast overflow, but I think we'll also do some things here that'll be pretty different than that. And then I've got some consulting stuff that I'll be doing, and we'll definitely be talking more about that here. I think it will be important that, particularly if I'm initiating like formally relationships with companies in the space, I do want to be sort of transparent about that, so that folks know where I'm coming from and why and what it is about those companies that makes them I see them as a fit of someone to work with. And so the good news is that as that all evolves, you will be able to find out about it here. And I'm really excited to do that. I'm really excited to kind of try this new medium. I love the kind of visual aspect of it, as well as the conversational bit. So I think the one thing that I definitely get from you is a desire to not just kind of get into a single groove and just sort of sit there. I turned 40 this year, and I feel like it's when you do get these moments where you can transition a little bit, especially as you get older, it's just, I think it's so important to try new things, to not just keep doing what you already know. If you have, and you don't always have the luxury to do that. It is absolutely a luxury. But I think of all the time, just, again, I think our move from California to Oregon when I was 10 years old, it's a very kind of formative time. And it was such, at the time, of course, I only noticed the sort of relatively superficial aspects of it, like walking to school instead of driving and things like that. But also, I mean, like that was when I started doing overlanding with you.
Exactly.
In the Cherokee, just heading out to Central Oregon and days, week at a time. And but then then you went from working in TV to like renovating old houses by yourself, or mostly.
It was a big shift.
Yeah, so I think, but I think it's always easy to be afraid of change, and to not and to be uncertain. But I think your experience and being able to see that as a kid, that making big changes isn't easy. It's hard. But it can allow you to do or to get closer to a feeling that you're doing what you want to be doing. Exactly. And I think that you never get there all the way. Everything has compromises. Everything is, imperfections or whatever. But I think, constantly sort of second guessing yourself about, is what I'm doing what I really want to be doing? And if not, if there are some aspects to it, what are those? And like just trying to figure out what they are, because it's not always obvious. That's something I feel like I've really taken from you, and it's it's worked out so far. So
that makes me feel good. All right.
If it all goes to shit, I'll blame you.
Whatever. You're gonna do fine. It's great.
All right. Well, this has been a ton of fun. I'm really glad we were able to do this.
All right.
I can definitely see doing this again. So
that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks for making the time.
My pleasure.
Thanks to all the audience, especially the folks from Curbside Classics who came over and hung out. Really awesome to see some familiar names down in the comment section that I remember from Curbside Classic, and even a couple from Truth About Cars days. So this has been great. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm not exactly sure when our next stream will be. Tomorrow I'm getting a root canal, so it will definitely be at least a few days.
It's gonna be, yeah.
But follow me on Twitter at Tweetermeyer, and you'll find out when we get live ones. And
All right.
I will be committing to a fixed schedule here at some point, I promise. So there will be set times where you can reliably know to come and tune in, and we'll have different conversations.
Great.
So with that, thanks everyone, and we'll see you here next time.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.